I think we will start in 1 minute. For my clock, it's 29. Hi, Annabelle. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi. We have all the slides from you, all good. So we are about just to start the webinar just in 10 seconds. Is that okay?
That's perfect.
Wonderful. Okay.
Perfect. Then we will go live now.
Okay, thank you, Karis. Welcome everyone to the ICLE Circular Webinars. This webinar is part of webinar series showcase how the Circular City Action Framework can be applied to different sectors at the local level through concrete cases from cities of different world regions. For this particular webinar, we will focus on built environments, where we will showcase different high-level circular economy approaches to the building sector and urban planning. At the same time, sharing concrete and actionable cases from the leading city that would join us today. I'm your host today. My name is Inchi Densoma from ICLE World Secretariat. ICLE is a global network of more than 2,500 local and regional governments committed to sustainable urban development. Warm welcome to you all and the speakers. Next slide. So we will start with a few housekeeping information for you. This session is being recorded and the recording session will be available on the ICLE Circular website. You can find a link in the message area. Feel free to introduce yourself and share which city you are joining us from in the chat box. Use the Q&A function to ask your question directly to our speaker, or just input into the Q&A box. We will address them after the presentation and at the end of the whole sessions. We would also like to inform you, ICLE will produce two-page sector guidance document based on the outcome and solution discussed today. Also during each webinar, which will be disseminated through ICLE channel and at the ICLE World Congress 2022. Next page. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce you the structure of webinar today. So we will start with a brief introduction to the theme today, and then we will have the input from our honorable speaker today. And at the end, we will have a dialogue with two Filipino cities, Mandaluyong and Quezon, as well as we will address the question from you all, from the participants. Next page. We are all very excited to have our speaker today. So today we have Catriona Brady, Director of Strategy and Development from World Green Building Council. The World Green Building Council is also a global network of national green building councils. It has members council in over 70 countries worldwide, which collectively have more than 49,000 members. We also have Annabelle Short here, who is senior advisor to environment from Institute for Human Rights and Business. IHRB is a leading international think tank on business and human rights. We also have Leslie Betty-Jones, Circular Economy Program Manager from Est Ensemble Grand Paris. Est Ensemble Grand Paris is an urban local authority gathering 9 cities in northeast suburb of Paris and with more than 400,000 inhabitants. And we also have my dear colleague from our ICLE European office, Kalin Diaz, Sustainable and Construction Circular Economy Officers here join us. At the end, we also have the voices directly from the other side of the globe who will join us also today, Abraham Rapunzel Jr. and Mark Dow Parrott from city of Mandaluyong and city of Quezon from Philippines. Thank you so much. Next page, please. So I would really like to start with my introduction with a quite a reoccurring message, but nevertheless very important one. The building sector is really a major emitter that generates nearly 40% of annual global GHG emissions. And within our projection, the global building stock would double around 2060, which gives us also a sort of implication what kind of GHG emission will grow with that kind of urbanizations. At the same time, we have absorbed this is quite a wasteful sectors, and that we observe this phenomenon in different stages of value chains. From planning, architects and urban planner and developer need to deal with very complicated building codes. In the building stage, we observe this is an area with really low productivity increase, below 1%. And in the stage of operation, we also observe nearly 60% of European offices are not in use in working hour. And this is a figure we had pre-COVID time. And we also have observed more than 50% of dwellers are reported living too big. Not to mention, there is still a huge potential for us to apply sustainable energy and other building services really to improve the physical conditions. At the end of life stage in the building life cycle, we also observe more than 50% of demolition material are going to landfills. And at the same time, we see all these situations also contributing to social challenges, such as housing rights, workers' rights, as well as consumers' rights. So I would like to start it with the challenges here, and we go to the next page, please. In relationship to the challenge we have observed, linear economy in building sector follow a take, make, waste models. Resources are extracted from the environment, take, use as a disposable products, make, and discarded after their use periods, waste. Linear economies are found to be linked to a range of negative impact in cities, including rising carbon emission, biodiversity loss, and waste management challenges. The Circular City Action Framework was hence developed to introduce city to a range of strategy and actions for circular transition at the local level. The action framework provides local governments with 5 R strategy and 15 linked actions. Next page, please. So we can see the framework on the left-hand side. The framework can really be used for 4 main purposes to assist local governments in the development of circular economy. The first is to expand cities' horizon on circular economy implementation beyond narrow or end-of-pipe solution like recycling. Secondly, it helps the city to identify existing circular practices in their jurisdictions. Thirdly, it helps the city to engage with variety of stakeholders in identifying circular economy intervention. And lastly, explore best practice from their own peers. You can learn more about 5R strategy, the actions, and the library of different city cases via the link we provide here. Next page, please. So at the end, from my side, we will also like to show you the city action framework can complement with building life cycle assessment. So in this diagram, you can see from the top left-hand side, we can see is the beginning of the building life cycle and go around to the lower left side. So we really see this action framework can complement building life cycle assessment and development by testing different strategies and actions at each stage to make the project more circular. One example can be, if we take a look at design and sourcing stage in the building life cycle, we can consider reuse and reduce strategy and take actions such as to prioritize renewable energy and renewable resources and support reuse, repair, and remanufacture. Thank you. Now, without further ado, next page, please. I would like to give the floor to Catriona. She will share with us about the importance of circular economy in tackling our climate waste and resource use issues. The floor is yours. It's yours, Catriona. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yingqi, and thank you to the ICLE team for having me today. So yes, my name is Katrina Brady. I'm Director of Strategy and Development at the World Green Building Council, talking to you today from London in the UK. Thank you so much for those opening remarks. I will build on those, and it was fantastic to see details about the Circular City Action Framework. I was actually screenshotting it and sending it to my colleagues while you were speaking, Yingqi, so thank you. That's a fantastic introduction. Next slide, please. And rolling on to the next slide, please. Thank you. I'll begin by introducing the World Green Building Council, who are, as you've heard, a global network of networks. We represent the 70 national green building councils around the world and their 36,000 members. Collectively, with our green building councils, we work to advance the ambition of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and to accelerate the critical systems transition that we need for sustainability at building, infrastructure, and city scale. Next slide, please. So in terms of our strategy, thank you, Yingqi, for framing that I was going to talk about how circularity fits in with climate and waste, because that's absolutely the underpinning message of the World Green Building Council's strategy, that these areas of sustainability are all interlinked, and we must take this holistic approach to sustainability. So looking at this diagram on screen, we have what we call 3 impact areas. Reading from left to right, looking at climate action. Within this, we're looking at decarbonisation and mitigation of climate change, looking at reducing whole life carbon emissions, operational and embodied carbon emissions. But then we're also looking at the adaptation and resilience side of climate change. We are tackling climate change, but we're also aware that it's happening whether or not we cut our emissions tomorrow. So there's a strong element of the resilience argument increasingly becoming relevant. Our second impact area is health and well-being. And I also look after our global program dedicated to the exploration of health, well-being, and social value at building community and across the supply chain. And I've had the great pleasure of working closely with Annabelle and her team over the last few years as we've looked to develop and champion principles of universal health across the whole built environment. And finally, our third impact area and the focus for today is what we call resources and circularity. And we deliberately named it this because we wanted to capture the circular economy in its very broadest sense. So within this topic, we are looking at the circular economy for materials within construction, circularity at city infrastructure scale, but also looking more broadly at biodiversity and natural capital and nature-based solutions, and also topics like water, which we realize that as an industry, we need to give stronger attention to. So this is a really exciting time for us to be talking and connecting with you, because we are about to set up a third global program to complement our work on climate and health, specifically for the circular economy. And that's launching in 3 weeks' time. So really exciting time. And we look forward to being able to hopefully work more closely with many of you as we embark on this strategic area. Next slide, please. So a tool or a vision that I hope may be helpful for you all is the World Green Building Council have developed what we call our North Star goal for each one of those impact areas. As you can see, they align to the targets of the relevant Sustainable Development Goals. So in this case, there's a strong lenience towards SDG 12 about responsible consumption and production, but also looking at 8 and 15 as well. And through an extensive consultation process in 2020, we came up with this North Star vision that as a sector, we would need to unite on a built environment that facilitates the regeneration of resources in natural systems whilst providing socio-economic benefit through a circular economy. And then we have supplementary goals underneath that for where we need to be by 2030, working towards a built environment with net zero whole life resource depletion. But then by 2050, to have achieved that target of no net resource depletion across the entire life cycle of built assets, and working towards the active restoration of resources and the regeneration of nature, which we know is one of our most fundamental strategies for tackling climate change and ensuring we're resilient to the forthcoming impacts. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a few words from me now to complement what Yingqi said about the challenge that we face as a sector. Next. Thank you. So the problem that we face as a buildings and construction sector is the sheer volume and geographic scale of the challenge. As we all know, the buildings and construction sector account for around 40% of global resource demand and 37% of energy-related carbon emissions. Specifically within that, over a third of global material consumption is for buildings, but less than 10%, less than 9% actually, of global materials are kept in productive cycles of use. So 91% of the materials that we are using for buildings, for infrastructure, are being used in that linear system that we've just heard about, that take, make, waste, disposal focused strategy, that direction towards landfill, and as well as being extremely harmful environmentally, the circulation of harmful chemicals that we know are embedded within many of the products that are buildings that we are sitting within right now is damaging to human health as well as ecosystem health. And I'm sure many of you have seen there are some truly horrifying statistics that there are chemicals being found within ice caps in the North Pole and everywhere in between. It's very difficult for us to escape the circulation of these chemicals which are in our system. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I think putting this into socioeconomic and demographic context is even more important because we have to be aware of the fact that globally there are billions of people emerging from poverty worldwide, and we have obviously a continually growing aspiration for every person to live as we do in the developed world, for every person to be entitled to a healthy, happy way of living with adequate resources, and to be able to move towards the targets of sustainable development, to live in the way the Sustainable Development Goals guide us. But we simply do not have enough resources for us to carry on with the consumption models that we currently use, that take, make, waste approach. And I think it's this context of the situation of the time is so important because there is obviously a lot of talk about a reductive model, about using less, about using fewer materials. But in this context of increasing urbanization, population growth, and sustainable development, it's clear that a transition to a circular approach is the only solution, as well as using less. That is certainly a strategy, but what we do have, we need to keep using for as long and in as sustainable way as possible. Next slide, please. Will take me on to sharing a circular theory of change. So let's talk a little bit about what the circular economy is and how we can apply those principles to the built environment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you've heard this just a few seconds ago about the principles of a circular economy being very different to a linear economy. And as I just mentioned a few slides ago, we know that the vast majority of materials being used in the construction industry for buildings and infrastructure and cities are predominantly being used in this linear fashion, take, make, waste, in which raw materials are collected, transformed into products, which are then used briefly and then thrown away, even if the products still retain usefulness and value. And in this system, value financially and in terms of use is created by business models that operate from creating and selling as many products as possible. But the problem, obviously, with this business model is it operates on the assumption that we have an infinite supply of raw materials, of energy, of labor, and we're starting to all increasingly realize that that's not the situation in which we actually live. So we are obviously, I'm sure, aware of the context of recycling, but there are key differences between the recycling economy and the circular economy. The circular economy being about taking a material back, whereas the recycling economy, I should say, is about taking a material back, repurposing it, and producing another product as if it was new, which obviously has embedded emissions within the recycling process. And whilst this is better than the linear economy, the take, make, waste system, the optimal solution for true sustainability is for us to be able to use materials in that even more circular way. Next slide, please. So 3 principles of a circular economy. These are championed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And looking left to right, first of all, designing out waste and pollution is a core principle. So we want to be reducing the creation of waste, ensure that our buildings, infrastructure, and cities are net zero operationally and across the whole life cycle, and removing toxins as well to ensure it's a healthy indoor environment for people in the local community, and that the materials can be circulated in future. Because if we have a building that has toxins embedded in it, or we have materials fused together with certain glues so they can't be dismantled, then even with your best intentions, it's very difficult for us to recover those materials. So we need to ensure that we're designing for buildings to be able to be dismantled. We're designing to minimize waste and pollution and enhancing human and ecosystem health. Secondly, keeping materials in use. Thank you. This is key, the difference, again, between the circular economy and recycling, that we don't necessarily want to have buildings that can be recycled. We want a built environment that can be dismantled. If we don't need the building to serve a function in 10 years' time, if we don't need it in 10 years' time, or it can be turned into something else. And the statistic that Ying-Chi gave at the beginning of his remarks about how 60% of office space is not being used is a perfect example of the opportunity that we will have of keeping these materials in use if we can dismantle them and then possibly repurpose them for different buildings that we do need, for example, to tackle our housing crisis. And finally, regeneration. One of the core principles of sustainability as well as circular economy is ultimately about improving the environment and enhancing the ecosystem services that underpin the world around us continuing to thrive. That also includes removing toxins from our buildings or our natural systems and bringing back biodiversity into cities, restoring nature, and lots of other elements within that. Next slide, please. So our colleagues at the World Business Council for the Sustainable Development did some great work last year in defining a circular building. And I thought this would be helpful to share it with you all, that a circular building optimizes the use of resources while minimizing waste through its whole life cycle. And as you can see on screen, they are specifically calling out the opportunity to use durable products and services, space efficiency over time with flexibility and adaptability, longevity, resilience, durability, easy maintenance and repairability, design for disassembly, reuse or recycling, and the use of life cycle assessments, life cycle costing, and digital information such as material passports in order to inform these sustainability decisions. And you can see more in the Business Case for Circular Buildings report. Next slide, please. Now, this is one of the case studies that is shown in the report, and I won't speak about this too much, but I just really like this as an example. These are they are called the Upcycle Studios in Denmark. And the windows of these were actually recycled from a public housing renovation. And I think windows and glazing in general is a sector in which the waste stream is usually very one-dimensional, and windows tend to be crushed and incinerated, even though there's often certainly huge amounts of functionality and residual life left in the products and components themselves. So the glass for this glazing has been rescued from a public housing renovation, and you can see it being practically used here. The fact that the material was already being used, they didn't source virgin and new materials, has reduced the embodied carbon and the whole life carbon footprint of this development. And it's a perfect example of the circular economy in action. Next slide, please. So just as a final couple of remarks from me, it really is so exciting to announce for the first time that the World Green Building Council will be launching this Circular Built Environment Accelerator Programme on the 16th of May. By that point, we will have a logo, which will be even more exciting. It will look better than my current slide. And we're very much looking forward to the official launch alongside our partners and continuing to support organisations like ICLEI, IHRB and many others in our collaborative mission in this space. The programme will be a central forum for knowledge sharing and facilitation amongst the green building councils and the wider industry. And as it grows, it will become a hub of resources, including practical guidelines, a state of the market report, market insights, principles for design, case studies, advocacy content, thought leadership, and much more. And we hope that many of you will find value from these resources and join us on this journey as we kick off. Next slide, please. Finally, if you would like to learn any more about this topic, myself and a number of our partners will be presenting at the Circular City Week in New York next week, exploring whether the built environment is an untapped opportunity for circularity, next Wednesday, 9 a.m. Eastern Time. So if you would like to join that conversation, please do join us. We're very excited about that. Next slide, please. So with that, I am delighted to close and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you all so much for your time today, and to Ying-Chi and the team at ICLEI for the invitation. Please do feel free to contact myself or any of the team at World GBC if you have any more questions, or of course your National Green Building Council. Yes, we will be sharing today's presentation with you all, I believe, so you can reach out to me via that, and I look forward to contributing further on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catriona. I really believe the approach you are taking is really important to really have much more innovative and bankable business coming into the market in this sector, as well as to create more sort of entrepreneurial environment spirits for this sector. It's a great presentation. Thank you so much. Then now I would like to introduce you to Annabelle and to her presentations. So Annabelle would join us from New York. So we can see very nice morning lights maybe from her headshot. So she will be sharing with us about the urgency and how to apply social equity and just transition lenses in this sector and at different stages of building life cycle. The floor is yours, Annabelle.
Thank you, Ying-Chi. Really wonderful to be here. And I think when we think about the 5 R's framework, the fact that it begins with rethink is so critical. And I think this webinar is a real example of that. Also, the fact that it's going to take a village, albeit a global village, of people from local governments, national governments, industry, civil society, tenants, workers who are actively at work within the built environment, all really shifting these systems together, because as the initial presentation highlighted, this is a very complex system and a very sort of entrenched business model that we're dealing with. Next slide, please. So I will be touching largely on the social implications of the materials supply chains in the construction and building industries. IHRB, as Yingqi said, is a leading global think and do tank, bringing a human rights lens to different business sectors. While we're sort of headquarters, as it were, as in London, we have colleagues in multiple countries around the world, and sister organizations, for example, in Myanmar, Colombia, and Denmark. Next slide, please. So I lead our program on human rights and the built environment, thinking about the ways in which human rights in all human rights are impacted throughout the built environment life cycle, and materials, as you will see from this presentation, is a very significant part of that. I thought I would start off by honing in on 3 specific materials, just first to elevate sort of the system that we're trying to move away from. And as the first 2 presentations have highlighted, obviously it's an extractive system with huge implications for the environment, for biodiversity, for climate change, and really for people as well. So when we think about sand, for example, which is the most extracted, not finite resource in the world after water, there are major implications for people in that process, all the way through to sand mafias in certain countries who are controlling the production and use of sand, to the erosion of local ecosystems, which then have implications for local fishing livelihoods, farming. Whole communities really devastated by the huge footprint of sand mining globally. Next, there's also a new UNEP agenda has just come out with 10 very powerful principles for dealing with the sand crisis. So highly recommend people checking that out if you have time. Next slide, please. And then when we think about wood and forestry, to elevate one particular dimension here, it's an area where workers in those industries are often out of sight, deep in the middle of forests, and often they're migrant workers who've come, from one country to another. So what we see is, rampant exploitation in the recruitment process, wage theft, and obviously very dangerous conditions, including conditions that are getting worse with the impacts of climate change in terms of forest fires, etc. Next slide, please. And then the third material to hone in on is copper, which, as many of you on this call I'm sure know, is a key material that's going to be in more and more demand with the green transition in terms of needing to electrification of buildings, in terms of renewable energy infrastructure and so on. So I think so important in this context to think, yes, we need a green transition, we need to shift to renewables, but we also need to really think about shifting the economic systems to reduce material impacts at the same time. Some really striking statistics here from the Sustainable Minerals Institute in Australia, that of the undeveloped copper ores globally, or bodies globally, 47% are either on or close to Indigenous peoples' lands, 65% are in high water risk areas, 65% are close to biodiversity conservation areas, and 50% are located in politically fragile jurisdictions. And I've worked on business impacts and human rights for many, many years. And so I think it's just so striking that within the new green economy, many of the human rights dimensions through supply chains and on sites are just as applicable, can be just as applicable in the green economy as they are in the traditional economy. Next slide, please. So while that sort of maybe painted quite a dark picture of where we are, and also the real need for action from a human as well as climate focus, it is encouraging that there's so much momentum underway. Katrina's presentation, for example, highlighting their upcoming initiative, which is really wonderful to hear about. The big report that comes out each year on the status of buildings and construction globally really elevated this year the importance of reducing emissions from materials and construction processes. Here in the US, where I am based, the White House announced a recent initiative to strengthen building performance standards involving 33 local governments throughout the country who are committed to reducing emissions and materials use in the built environment, which is great. In South Africa and many other countries are thinking about what their just transition process should look like to move from high emitting to low carbon economies. In the South African one, for example, it was interesting that while the focus was on the shift away from coal, because that's so important in that country, it highlighted also the need for coal producing areas to start developing new economic hubs around different industries, including the local generation of building materials supplies. So huge amounts of opportunities in thinking through the ways that different sectors will be impacted by the transition and ensuring it's a just one. Similarly, in the EU, as many of you are familiar, there's a huge amount of financial and political momentum at the moment flowing into countries and cities to decarbonize the built environment, which is welcome, and the key will be in the implementation and impactful and thoughtful use of those resources. Next slide, please. So harnessing all of that momentum, I think, builds a huge amount of opportunity. I do think it's important to elevate that circularity per se won't necessarily address some of the social inequality issues that I highlighted earlier, and it's really important that they are front and center as we're thinking about circular construction practices. These three lenses often come up in thinking about just transition processes in terms of the need for procedural justice, restorative justice, and distributive justice, thinking about who is involved in processes and economic shifts, how are their voices actually heard and taken into account to really shape decision making is fundamental. Restorative, there are opportunities to think about people who've traditionally been discriminated against or have faced barriers to employment, or have been segregated in different parts of cities. Those issues being really kind of addressed through the ways in which circular construction and building practices and industries are advanced. And then distributive, important to be thinking within different parts of cities, who's benefiting from these changes, who might be losing out, actually also globally too, obviously, in terms of supply chain implications. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning, our program on the built environment and human rights takes this life cycle approach, thinking about what are the potential risks to human rights at each stage of the built environment life cycle, starting right at the fundamental issue of land. Who owns it? What processes are underway in terms of land acquisition processes? How does land use impact human rights, all the way through to architects and design decisions, to the construction process itself, management and use of buildings and infrastructure, and within the demolition and redevelopment stage as well. This is one way of thinking about the building project life cycle. I recognize that then within design and construction, you can have your sort of additional loop that's there that was highlighted in the other presentations around the materials life cycle as well, which is very much connected. I was struck in the Circular Buildings Toolkit developed by ICLEI, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and others around the emphasis of decisions made at the earliest stage of a project have the greatest potential impact. And that's very much what we try to highlight in this framework, behind which sit a lot of guiding questions for action on all of these issues, recommendations for different sectors and actors who are involved, and then references across to existing international human rights standards and sustainable development goals. So we're not saying this is a new framework by any means. We're saying this is what it looks like in practice if we were to actually put the sustainable development goals and international human rights standards into practice in the way that we build. Next slide, please. Keeping an eye on time here. as I mentioned, the idea is is recognizing that there are multiple actors within this ecosystem. And so a real focus on harnessing the leverage points that actors have over the system. Users, communities, and workers needing to really be there in the center in terms of actively shaping the way that decisions are made. On the left there, I've highlighted some of the ways that are particularly relevant in terms of shifting materials. Public procurement, many of the cities who are on this call obviously will be familiar with that, can have a really influential role in shifting materials used in other decisions in the built environment. I'll also highlight down there design decisions and product specification. Here in the US is a group called Design for Freedom, for example, who are architects and engineers who are trying to reduce risks of forced labor through material supply chains. And part of what they're trying to roll out is including product specifications within project plans to ensure that there's no worker exploitation in the materials that are used in their building, for example. I put policy advocacy down there at the bottom because I feel like everyone who's involved in this space can be engaged in different ways, collectively and individually, in policy advocacy. Next slide, please. In addition to putting our framework into practice at the policy level through advocacy, engagement with different actors, we're also doing so at the level of specific projects. And this is a project in Norway, which is very much in line with the idea of circularity in the built environment, in that it's a former teacher training center where the whole building is being reconverted into a center that the city is using to provide services for newly arrived immigrants and refugees in the country. And should also highlight that the city is a human rights city. And I don't know if there are other human rights cities on this call, but many cities globally have chosen to designate themselves as human rights cities, and Bergen recognized that one way that they can put that commitment into practice is by integrating a human rights approach throughout the life cycle of a building project. So they've taken our framework and then they're using it to influence decisions around participation, design, the use of the building, and how spaces will foment more interaction between people who are there to use the services and the local communities through the space of the building. And pretty awesome to see how it's changed sort of hearts and minds amongst the project team who are involved in that project. Next slide, please. Very briefly, just wanted to touch here on 3 of the core sort of human rights thematic areas that I feel are really pressing today, and that therefore we need to have very much in mind in thinking about circularity in the built environment. So one obviously is in terms of the workers who are physically working both on the building materials side and on the construction of buildings and infrastructure, and how are there opportunities to create more diverse workforces through circular practices. How can cities partner with local trade unions, bring in others within coalitions with workers groups such as housing groups, indigenous rights groups, etc. So really flagging that workers' rights organizations need to be a key partner here. Next slide, please. Like one of the other, pressing and very related issues that Inti touched on at the beginning too is the right to housing. The UN rapporteur on the right to adequate housing is actually just now doing a consultation on the right to adequate housing and climate change. So if anyone's interested and needs the link to that, do let me know so you can provide your input to his questions for a report that he'll be bringing out next year. I feel like the key dimension that again links back to the 5R framework here is around first thinking about what needs to get built when we're thinking about reducing resources in the built environment. Everyone here will be very aware that there's a pressing need for new housing and a lot of new building that's going to have to happen globally for increased populations. But current economic models also mean that a lot of buildings sit empty. So cities and national governments have a key role to play in terms of reducing over-construction when buildings are not being used, and which then has impacts on pricing for other people in terms of accessing adequate housing. Next slide, please. And another dimension on the housing side is, the transformative way in which thinking about materials can actually improve existing houses and create decent places for people to live. This is a really powerful example that we'll be highlighting in a set of participatory process interviews shortly on our website from Portugal, where volunteers work in rural areas, connect with local industries providing and supplying materials to renovate homes that are in a really bad state of repair, highly energy inefficient, for example. And just one example of quite how transformative for people circular practices can be. Next slide. Last of the sort of three key areas, workers' rights, housing, and then local economies. I feel like the conflict currently, in addition to climate impacts, are just such a reminder of how vulnerable our supply chains are, and therefore how much resilience, in many senses of the word, that you can create through building and supporting local practices around materials for construction. So this is an example of a hospital in Rwanda designed by Mass Design, where they realized that there was a local volcanic rock that was actually being seen by local farmers as a hindrance to their agricultural practices. It wasn't being used, it was more just getting in the way, and realized that that could be used to build the hospital, which has now led to multiple local people developing their own industries around construction with that rock. And next slide, please. So this is just to say thank you. My email address is up there, as well as my colleague Andrea Fidalgo, based in Denmark. Do get in touch with any questions. Bottom left down there is a joint piece that I did with Yingqi on the way that women and girls need to be at the center of transformation in the built environment. I also wanted to flag that upcoming over the next 2 years, together with ICLEI and multiple other stakeholders, will be doing a Just Transitions project, looking very deeply in some specific cities and then the wider national contexts in which they sit on, what are the obstacles to getting this right, and then what are the ways that people can work collectively to overcome them. So watch this space. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. This is really inspiring. So sometimes when I'm talking with my architect's friend or urban planner plan, we talk about, so what is innovative solution now to the kind of social issue we have in this sector? So very often we go very extreme about the accessibility to the toilets, or like really contagious issue about social housing. So I really appreciate your presentation, like give us really a wide scopes and also very practical one, offering us tools, and also for different kinds of stakeholder at all stages of supply chain and value chains, like really empowering architects, policymakers, designer, as well as workers. I think it's really, really encourage everyone to check out IHRB's website for more information. So now let me give the microphone as well the floor to Leslie. She will be sharing with us about the role of local authority to develop the local supply chain for reused materials. And I believe she's joined us from Paris. The floor is yours, Leslie.
Close to Paris.
Close
Thank
Paris.
you. Yeah, thank you, Yingqi, for the introduction. So I'm Leslie Petitjean. I'm actually a circular economy project manager in my local authority, specialized in building materials, actually. So I'm working in the environment and urban ecology department in my local authority, which is called Est-Ensemble Grand Paris. So next slide, please, just for the introduction and to, yeah, the next one. This was my first slide. Thanks. So just for you to know where is Est-Ensemble, is actually close to Paris. So it's not really in the city of Paris, it's in the metropolitan area of Paris, and it's actually in the northeast of Paris. So we are really a dense area, really urban. We are what we can call a territorial cluster of 9 cities, like what Yingqi said in the introduction. more than 400,000 inhabitants on the territory. And the main thing in this territory, in the next year, there will be a lot of demolition and construction sites. So it's a territory that really changed a lot, actually. And I want to stress also the fact that this local authority is actually quite new, like has been created in the beginning of in the 2000 years. And since the beginning, we are really involved to build more environmental principle in our different sector of local policies. So actually, maybe to stress the strategy, we have a climate actions plan since 5 years, and also a circular economy plan since 3 years. And what we have done in the circular economy action plan is to define the mainstream we want to work on, and the one which will have more impact on the territory. And like we can imagine, like the building material and the construction sector was one of the most impactful. So we put a lot of strength on it. And that's why my job is totally focused on how we can develop actually a local supply chain. Also, what I want to highlight is the fact that we work with a lot of partners, and mostly social housing companies as well, and urban planning companies. And actually my presentation will be more, not that much about the building level, which what Annabelle and Catriana said. It was more on the building level, and also how we can increase the regulatory framework on a national or international level. I will be more focused on the role actually of the local authority and the role of facilitation, how we can build an ecosystem, a stakeholder ecosystem, which can work together and increase actually the synergy between the building sites. So next slide, please. Thank you. So actually what we have conducted, like the first milestone of the strategy was to conduct an urban metabolism study that we focused mostly on building materials. So actually, I think maybe most of you are aware about what is the urban metabolism study. It's like to consider the territory as an organism with flows which are coming out and flows which are coming in, and actually to consider the territory as a mine, as a urban mine, where we can take the resource. And actually the goal is to measure our dependency to the external resource and how we can actually minimize this dependency on external resource. So actually the main result is that in the coming years, in the to 2025, we'll be really dependent on external resource. So actually the red flag that you can see is represent the demolition sites that will represent around 1 million ton of materials. So 1 million ton of materials of waste, that we can call waste, but we prefer to use resources, will be produced according to the different program of demolition that we have on the territory. And actually to rebuild the program we have, we will need 3 times more of resources, of materials. And so what we imagined when we conducted this study for the beginning, it was like maybe we will have an equivalence between what we will produce as waste and what we will need as resources. And actually we can really see that we will need more materials. And we know in the context that there will be some tension about how we can provide all these materials. So actually this first step is actually quite important, just to raise awareness to policymakers and to practitioners, and also to the different stakeholders, just to highlight the fact that there will be some tension in the coming years about how to provide all the needs for the materials we need to build the public space, to build the buildings. And just the graphic on the top right is just to stress the fact that we are really dependent on the concrete, actually, like beton is like the concrete, and actually about the sand. This is what you say, like the sand, there will be a lot of tension on it. And so as I said, it was the first step. And after the study, well, it allows us to have a good basis on our dependency, like the practitioners, and especially like the urban planning, my urban planning colleagues were more aware also about the tension that are going to be in the coming years. So it helps us to establish an action plan on how, actually what is the role of local authority to build a more local supply chain. So next slide, please. Thank you. So actually this slide represents our main strategy and the 3 pillars to actually like we don't, I mean, I prefer not talking that much now about how we manage the waste of the building, but actually how we can relocate and implement local supply chain for materials, building materials, sorry, and how we can create, I mean, this is our main goal, synergies between demolition sites and construction sites on the territory, on the local level. So for this, we have 3 main action and axes. So the first one is actually central for me, is how we develop supply chain equipment to store, actually, because the problem of storage when we want to develop local supply chain is really central. Like if you have a demolition site on a city that will be demolished, I don't know, in February, and like you want to reuse the materials in construction site in May, for example. So you have this time between. And actually the main question we always face to is, where do we store the materials and how we can refurbish them, transform them to reuse them on a construction site. And so this is central because actually this is a really dense territory. There are a lot of projects coming up, and actually there are a lot of tension on the land. And it's also like for policymakers, it's not always well perceived to have this kind of equipment on the territory. Like actually we like to talk about logistic and supply chain. And when you talk about relocation and how to relocate industry, well, we know from environmental point of view that this is really important. But from a social and for the inhabitants, it's not really well perceived because it will cause some nuisance. And yeah, so we have also to work to raise awareness to policymakers that this is really important to have this kind of equipment with also social acceptability of it. So the first, and I will talk about this a bit more on the next slide, but this is the first point, how we can develop some storage and refurbishment place, like local platform, what we can call. The second pillar is how we develop the stakeholder synergy. And actually is how we how do we experiment and we prove that this new methodology to build differently can work actually and can be efficient. So I'm going to talk also about this in the coming slides, and how we can actually work more together, and actually how we can build offers and demand at the same time. Because for me, this is the main issue, is actually there are more and more offers for reuse material. So we more and more contracting authority are conducting some diagnosis to estimate the quantity and the type of material that will be demolished. So this is the part of the offer of reuse material. But actually the problem is when you build, most of architects and most of contracting authorities, they just don't want, or they are just not aware that they can also use some reuse materials for their construction. And so we have to build at the same time the offer and the demand. And this is kind of the biggest challenge for it. So for this, we are facilitating some workshop between the main stakeholders to actually make them connecting their resource between each other. Also, we are developing with a local authority close to mine matching e-tools, actually, because the technology can help. Actually, this is what we think, that it can help to connect this resource and to connect the offer and the demand. And the last point as well is, as we have also the economic development jurisdiction as a local authority, actually how we support the development of this economic sector is also huge for us, and also how this new strategy can help us to relocate some employee as well. Some like the question of unemployment is really important on our territory, and we can perceive circular economy as an opportunity to build some new jobs and really local jobs that can have that can benefit to the population actually, and also how we can help economic actors, mostly in SSE, like social and solidarity sector, to develop their business model, because also one of the challenges, like for now, the business model, they don't really exist. Actually, they are not that viable for the moment. So how, as a local authority, as a public administration, we can help them and support them to stabilize this business model. So next slide, please. Thank you. So this one is actually a project we developed. Like the picture you can see is a local logistic infrastructure we want to build with a partner of urban logistic. And it's actually what I was talking about in the previous slide, is how we can relocate the production, actually, how a urban city can become productive again, how we can, like, I like to make the comparison with the food, actually, because we are mostly aware about the problem of food, and like we need to have some production place closer than to consumption place, and it's roughly the same for materials, for building materials. And so, as I said, how we can build this in between place to store and to refurbish the materials. And what we tend to do as well, because when we talk about circular economy, we can talk about recycling, but what we want to mostly do is to encourage the reuse of materials. Also, there are more impacts on jobs, on local jobs as well. So that's why we also focus more on reuse, and it's also more environmentally efficient. So now the project we have is, I think it will come in 2025 or 26, because we need time to develop the business model, and so to also develop the architecture program as well. So I think it will look like for a bit like this, but the main thing is we want to host different service in this equipment. So there will be kind of a landfill for building materials, but there will be also some workshop for craftsmen, which will be able to transform, like for example, transform the wood. There are a lot of SSE actors who were working on the wood industry on this. Like for example, they can just transform the windows from a social housing company to produce some furniture. I mean, this is kind of example, but the goal is to develop and to have many companies hosting in this building. Yeah, and so, as I said, it's really central for our strategy. And so this is one of the examples, but we also want to develop, like this one is a long-term project, but what we also try to do is to identify some other lands, like temporary land as well, which can host this kind of project. And as I said, we also want to help business and companies to stabilize their business model. So we work closely, I work closely with my colleagues from the Economic Development Department on this topic, actually. So next slide. Yeah, so this slide is actually about I think it was important to make the focus on this project, which is actually the most advanced project we have on the territory, because it demonstrates how we can concretely reuse the materials at a really local scale, actually at the in a local neighborhood, which is in renovation, how we can develop the partnership with stakeholders to reuse the materials. So actually this is a project we're managing with a social housing company, which is called Sensani Habitat. This is the main company of social housing in the department. And actually the project, which is currently, it's just like the demolition site has just begun like the last month. So we will cut actually some walls made from concrete. So some of the wall from the social housing company will be cut. They're going to be cut, and they will sell this material to us, to Est Ensemble, because we will settle this paving stone on the future public space in the neighborhood. So our role is we will buy the materials, we will finish to transfer them, we will store them on a local platform in the heart of the neighborhood. And what is also important in this project is like the platform where the paving stone will be stored. It will be also a place where there will be some workshop with the inhabitants, with the citizens in the neighborhood, to raise them to raise awareness about circular economy topics. There will be also some kind of workshop where they can be their old furniture from reused materials, but it's also a way to just also make them understand what we're doing on the neighborhood. Because sometimes like inhabitants and citizens, they can be a bit far from this topic. So it's also a good way to just integrate them in this strategy. And yeah, the next step will be to settle this paving stone on the public space. And actually this project also help us to develop a methodology that we can put and like to do this, to make the upscaling that is necessary, and to make the step between experimental site and globalization, I would say. This is really important to have this kind of experimental project where we can have some feedback, where we can also see if there is a business model or if there is a balance economic model on this, which is, to be totally transparent, which is not the case for the moment. On this project, actually the paving stone costs more than a new one, which is actually quite normal, because like our first idea was we will save the raw material, so it's going to be less expensive. But it's actually wrong, because all the different steps of transformation and of logistic, well, in the industry, they have optimized all the different steps. So as we made it as a craftsman, I would say, well, it costs more, but it's actually quite normal for the moment, because this is at the stage of experimentation. And if we upscale this, well, we hope that they're going to be a more balanced business model on this. Yeah, I think I'm over mostly. If there are other, I mean, if you have further questions, feel free in the chat.
Leslie. First, congratulations! Wow, this is very, very advanced. Your projects. Yeah, it's not only a material flow analysis management, it's also kind of the whole tools and initiative you develop around that. I mean, I agree with Annabelle. We have observed some city in the USA have very similar approach and projects. Mm-hmm. So in the future, we will happy to facilitate maybe conversation among you guys.
To be nice.
So,
to be nice.
Great, thank you so much. Then I would now really like to give the floor to Kathleen. And we are a little bit over the time, so I'm just gonna let Kathleen jump straight in. So the floor is yours, Kathleen.
So thanks, Ying, and please, of course, stop me when we need time for the Q&A. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm Caitlin Dietz. I work for ICLE Europe as a Sustainable Construction and Circular Economy Officer. My background is as an architectural engineer and urbanist. Next slide, please. So I will cover a little bit based on projects I've been working on. We work with and for cities in Europe, and particularly I'll talk about some innovations in pilot projects in small and medium-sized cities in the City Loops project. And then kind of conclusions from the dozens of cities I've seen pilots from on what the main barriers, levers, and keys to success are for making progress at the local and regional level on circular construction. And I'll finish with a long list of resources for further reading for those interested. Next slide. So I think these arguments have been made extremely well by the previous speaker. So I will just briefly go over that this is an imperative. It's not an option, basically, to reduce climate impacts of this sector and certainly the primary material use. But there are a lot of bright sides, a lot of positives that are possible, not given, but they're possible with the circular approach to construction. So, for example, you have optimized planning and land use that can avoid the need for new construction by taking advantage of unused or underused spaces. Also, this kind of temporary use that Leslie was talking about. You have opportunities for more equitable access to urban space. So with lowered costs through modular construction, prefabricated construction, alternative construction methods that can eventually, once the business model for secondary materials is more solid, can also lower costs. And of course, the increased supply of space when all of these speculative unoccupied spaces are freed up for other uses. You also have alternative tenancy models like cession of use for cooperative housing or co-living that can make shared spaces a model that give also community benefits, community building benefits. And finally, the jobs point that's been mentioned already before. We have really good examples in Vienna and in Brussels with Baucarousel and Rotor DC of labor inclusion, labor market inclusion through using this more labor intensive activity of dismantling and selective demolition or selective demolition for renovations also. So there's a lot to gain and let's see how. Next slide. So working with cities so far, especially in this pilot phase that many of them are in at this point, there are a number of barriers here. I find these to be common, but would be very keen to hear if others run into the same ones. So there's a major shift in thinking that's happening from the traditional, okay, green building means energy efficient HVAC and good windows. And we have to really broaden that now and think about whole life carbon in a way that involves people from the value chain from beginning to end. And as said, starting very early in the planning stage. So there's a shift in the whole mentality of architects, engineers, designers, and contractors. When we think of embodied carbon, it changes the way you choose materials, it changes the way you choose the design and construction system. Then there's the huge logistics challenge that Leslie has also spoken largely to with this hub initiative of Estonia. So there's a need for storage. There's a need for knowing that there is a solid demand for the material that you're selected demolishing, because otherwise there's simply not a real savings in terms of cost for the storage and logistics around it. Then there's the nature of secondary materials as they are. You can see here recovered bricks in Oslo in the picture. Secondary materials are heterogeneous. They're often in a limited supply. And there's often a very limited data available about their quality, numbers, maintenance history, hazardous content or toxicity, and so on. And that, if there is also a certification barrier, this is hopefully going to be remedied with the new construction products regulation in Europe, but we are looking at a kind of data gap that also makes it more difficult for architects and engineers or anyone risking their professional reputation and without the proper insurances to be willing to use secondary construction materials. Then we have the point of digital tools. These are popping up left and right really these days, and there's a great need for harmonization here. And it's hard to justify in the beginning kind of the learning curve for practitioners to learn how to use the tools and to go through the documentation process. Again, if there's not that sure demand that there will be a future use for these. And last, but certainly something that's going to be a long-term shift is the awareness and the skills of professionals in this sector. So something that starts at schools and in university curriculum and really through vocational schools, and is something that is an ongoing process, both for the energy and digital transition, but also for circularity, given this special nature of working with secondary materials in particular. Next slide. So I would like to speak now to very briefly to many projects going on in the City Loops project. This project is a bit particular because it's an innovation action with small and medium-sized cities, so 50 to 100,000 inhabitants mostly, which really represents the everyman, the average Joe of a European city, which I think makes it particularly interesting. So I will just touch very briefly on these. In Bodø in Norway, for example, they are decommissioning a military airport and will turn it into a new district of the city, practically doubles the footprint of the city. But of course, there are a lot of structures and materials in this area already. They will make new use of. So they will turn the old runway into the main street of this area, for example. But they're using a really innovative digital tool to do it. And they're using this digital tool to keep track of all of the data, to be able to plan accordingly, also with live energy, traffic, air quality information incorporated. It's a digital twin. And they use this also to be able to envision future scenarios in citizen workshops. So they bring in the community, especially with targeted awareness and involvement of marginalized groups like migrants, young people, or women, or elderly. And they do this so that everyone feels buy-in in taking part of this creation of the new city. You can see some pictures on the next slide. Yeah, there's a lot going on here, but you can see a lot of selective demolition going on. You can see in the top left the new town hall site in Høyestestrup. They did a demolition of housing blocks that you can see in top center and salvaged 10,000 tons of concrete that was crushed and then used to make the largest public building with a recycled concrete foundation in Denmark. You can see also some digital tools being used. The one in the bottom right is the one from Bodø with their mapping there of contaminated masses on the old military site, the adaptive reuse of a hangar building to make a football pitch. And you see in the middle right, a marketplace, digital marketplace to match supply and demand of secondary materials used in Apeldoorn. Next slide. So there are 6 cities piloting innovations here in City Loops. What to highlight here in Roskilde in Denmark, for example, this is in the Copenhagen capital region. They have an old concrete factory in an area that's called Musikon. And they're keeping a lot of these old concrete structures as architectural heritage and as a place for a lot of experimentation. And they have a warehouse hall where they've used CO2 footprint calculations to be able to make the argument up the chain, basically, of decision making to prove the case for why keeping the structure intact as far as possible is the best possible solution. They also have innovative circular procurement. They're doing fixed price tenders that ask for awarding the contract based especially on innovation and specifically on using in a creative way the secondary materials that the city has been harvesting and storing themselves. So they have competition then between the contractors completely on a circular basis, so for environment and quality. And do this based on, yes, also things like design for disassembly in the new construction pieces. Next slide, we have a few more pictures. Yes, so you have on the bottom left resource sheds that are bike storage facilities between the housing blocks at Musikon using secondary materials that were harvested there on the site. Or you have in the top right, a new parking garage that was built with the facade materials coming from secondary sources as well. And they're doing interesting soil balance initiatives also in Roskilde, where they predict several years in advance what will be the construction activities, what are the big urban developments foreseen, how many tons of soil can we avoid excavating and moving from side to side around the city. And using this excess mass, for example, within the same Musicon site to make landscaping, but also climate adaptation in areas that are prone to flooding. Next slide. So in summary, here I will present basically what we understand to be the keys to success, the key strategies to bear in mind for local authorities facing circular construction and wanting to get started with this topic. First, and again, a point to reiterate, because it's worth saying again and again, the most important is to avoid demolishing what doesn't need to be demolished, to renovate everything that can be renovated. This very much aligns to the renovation wave being pushed in Europe now. So there are great examples and arguments for adaptive reuse of existing structure. Of course, this also has benefits like preserving cultural heritage and character of neighborhoods. Second, it's very important that pre-demolition audits become completely mandatory and mainstream in a very holistic way. So it's very common in most European countries to have the hazardous material and environmental quality analysis. So it's not impossible to dream that this be expanded to also be making a compiled inventory of all salvageable, recyclable, reusable, dismountable materials with residual value. This does, however, as we've seen, have to go alongside the development of demand on the new construction side for using these secondary materials, so that there is, of course, the business case for the effort required for the deconstruction and storage. Finally, planning and partnerships. As I said, this is really key to get everyone to make it feasible in reality. Next slide. Then on the renovation and construction side, we have the need to really start early with what is our ambition going to be. It's also imperative that you don't say we want a building made of this percentage of this material, because you need to leave it open to the professionals to be able to innovate in this sense. You have a lot of certifications and building standards that are also potentially stifling innovation when it comes to materials that are not certified, like secondary materials might be. As a construction client, of course, there's a lot that you can do in asking for circular design, so flexible programming for structures that can be adapted as quickly as possible and avoid being deeply renovated to waste material during their usable life, selecting materials that are really locally secondary sourced, bio-based, durable and reparable, and keeping the data on board so that, again, maintenance in the future can be smooth. Next slide. And it's really key to move beyond asking for lowest price. This is really common in public authorities still today, that we get lowest price tenders. So we have to consider the whole cost of ownership. We have to consider the whole life carbon and think about the other things that are impacting us, of course, beyond our pocketbook. It's also really important to consider the roles and risks of different actors in the construction sector, because this can shift greatly. Also because it's a very risk-averse and conservative sector traditionally, and so it's important to consider and negotiate these things from the beginning. And of course, there are many ways to get the data and use life cycle assessments, use standards that can help you understand this picture so that you can have a fair comparison of whole life impacts, social, environmental, carbon, and so on. Next slide. So I don't think I have the time to finish going into these, but there are many examples here to share of other ways that local authorities can take the lead here. I think Leslie summed them up with an example for all three of these very well. Next slide. Yes, again, I'm afraid we really just don't have the time. yes, I would just say these lessons come from working with many cities, and you have here in the slides lots of further resources. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Sorry we have to rush you through your presentations. Still so much interesting thing to learn from you. But I do encourage the participants and speakers to get in touch with Kathleen if you would like to learn more about her experience and the projects with City Loops. I think this brings us to very nicely to our last part of the webinar today. Before that, I would like to apologize. I'm not doing such a good job as host. So if you do have extra 10 minutes, please stay with us 10 more minutes. So we can finish this session very nicely. So, in this very last part of the webinar, we would like to bring kind of also activity and a voice from another side of the globe. Since we know many presentations today represent activity and projects more in the global north cities, so we have more of a brownfield approach, where we focus a lot on upgrading, urban renewal, urban redevelopment, and reskilling. However, we know the next growth phase will be in the global south, the next urbanization and growth south. So we can really see the tools we have developed, the experience we have developed can really benefit to another world regions, since they will have still a lot of things need to be built. So without further ado, I will invite first Mr. Abraham Rapunzel Jr. from city of Mandaluyong, apologize. Briefly share with us about your activity in your city, please. The floor is yours, Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Ying. Do I come to you clear and with my audio? Let me share my screen.
Wait, yeah, while you are trying to share your screen, Abraham, yeah, great, it works, please.
Okay. Since we have a limited time, I can walk through you to the experience of the city of Mandaluyong on behalf of our city mayor, Carmelita Abalos. This is an opportunity to learn with you guys and level up with your circular buildings and construction. I learned a lot from your resource speaker, and it will help me in formulating for the newer version of our ordinance. Let me get me to my slide. So the profile introduced to our city and our initiative in protection and promotion of a sustainable environment and the green building project, as well as the sample project of the city and our city next step. So to begin with, our Mandaluyong is located at the core of Metro Manila, wherein we have a limited land area of almost 1,000 areas, as well as with a booming population of 400,000 plus with a growth rate of 2%. These are the challenges we are experiencing with the built environment, as well as the challenges of investment from the private sector. So to have an overview of our city, these are our famous landmark and our city from the 100 years file or slide. So these are institutional development, as well as development of the city government, as well as infrastructure connection within our city, because the central location of Mandaluyong is in the core of the Metro Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines. Which this to the present situation wherein the built environment is already on the urban sprawl, wherein the Metro Manila is already in a mega region comprising of different localities within the. So the location of Mandaluyong is a location in the central part of the capital, wherein our limited space should dwell in the development of the built environment. So the initiative of recently, the Mandaluyong had acquired the certification of registration for the ISO 9000 for our commitment to improve the services and delivery of our to the stakeholder. So with our mission vision established in the institutional management of all the frontline environment as well as environmental, and then the importance of the people of collective action in doing and meeting our mission, as well our vision of to be a world-class city. We're in a well-planned, sustainable environment where we nurture the global standard competence and the leadership of visionary is in place. So with our initiative, we started in replacing our light switches and to augment the load of the energy of the city, as well yung energy efficiency and conservation is our main task. Wherein this measure and programs is dwell to contribute to the climate change and to the conservation and other available institutional arrangement that will be formalized. This measure of tapping to the services and contributing to the efficiency and the transport, as well as shifting to electronic vehicle where we can serve with our metro stakeholder. So these are dwell on environmental protection as well as the health of the city, as well as the measure in managing our waste and MRF, material recovery, as well as the use of available materials that when we can recycle and then we can reuse, and regulating some toxic materials and plastic ban in the city, as well as the management of the solid management plan. So these are the measure and integrating also the development of our riverfront development, wherein encouragement of the active lifespan or active lifestyle of the people, wherein they can commune with the communities and then develop to a sustainable, wherein the lifestyle of people is important. So these are other project and for protection of environment, and then the development of our greeneries with the city park, and then common project. So to give you a brief background of our experience in formulating the Green Bin Ordinance, since 2012, we have partnered with the International Finance Corporation, wherein these are cooperation agreement, establishment of the ordinance, and then the market analysis of the existing materials in the market, as well as formulation of the Green Building Ordinance. So these are the activities that we held, and this experience appreciate the effort that our partner with the IFC and visiting with the stakeholder, as well as engagement with the public stakeholder in consulting their side in accepting this regulation. So come 2014, we have adopted the Green Building Regulation of Mandaluyong, as well as these are our initial step in contributing to the climate change problem. So come 2018, we already have version 2 of the initial regulation, Green Building Regulation, wherein we expanded and cover more new construction project to better meet the more challenging ahead in the built environment of our city. So with this comparison from the 18 mandatory measure of the original, as well expanded to the 40 green building measure, wherein the coverage of this measure had been established, as well as introducing the building certification for the new construction, as well as the optional measure of development to the renewable energy, as well as site sustainability, indoor environment quality, as well as yung energy and water efficiency, as well as material efficiency and solid waste management. These are the measures that we integrated with the regulation, wherein the water efficiency and the integration of indoor air quality environment, as well as the site protection and water efficiency has been the highlight, as well as all the contributory measure that we can contribute to the reduction and the maximize of efficiency of the energy in our built environment. So this measure and certification compelled all new building owners to to secure for their building certification and permit, wherein this certification is tie up on the regulation of green building ordinance with the city. So with that, since 2014, we already have evaluated almost a 3 million total floor area of new construction building within the cities. And with this, as well as we already have issued the final green building compliance certificate for the occupancy certificate of new buildings, wherein all the measure integrated with their project, and then sustainable environment and green building measure have been validated on site. So to come up with this, the ordinance of the city of Mandaluyong is very effective. We have computed the projected annual energy savings from the our database. So we have computed annual of 50 million kilowatt hour for the 22 project we have completed and computed. This translates to the energy savings of almost can power the 120,000 homes with the computed projected savings, as well as fuel savings per year if we compute it to the consumption of 5,700 cars, as well as the avoidance emission per year equivalent to 13,000 cars. These are our projected computation for the 22 building, as well as we already also computed the water savings from the green building regulation, wherein we have computed a 490,000 million liters for the 22 building, which can equivalent to supply 4,000 homes with these projected savings. So the city only have committed and commitment in implementing our city project, wherein all the applicable measure of integrating to the new buildings and maximizing the use of materials been integrated to our city projects. So these are a snapshot of the completed projects that the city green building has implemented. So these are ongoing projects and pipeline. So currently we had new ongoing projects of the Mandaluyong Coliseum and Civic Center, wherein all the applicable measures have been integrated to the projects, and then it's on construction stage, wherein the managing the sustainable construction method had been in place and directed to the construction team, and the priority management had been monitoring it already. So these are proposed project of the city, as well as integrating in the design and the passive cooling of and available materials, as well as maximizing the orientation, as well as efficient air conditioning, and then integrating also the rainwater harvesting system, wherein we can tap and reduce the use of pristine drinkable water. So the city's next step, based on the presented earlier with our presenter, it's a learning eye-opening for me that circular buildings and construction, it's been mainstream and integrated to the new strategies in implementing in the local setting. So we have already on that formulating for the integrating the principle of circular building in the new version of the green building ordinance, and then engaging the stakeholder for their proactive ownership, wherein they will be consulted, and then I can include the circular building principle, as well as I list some formulate keynote in review recent implementation experience, as well as our experience with the pandemic and the geopolitical conflict has been. I think it can contribute to the built environment, wherein the supply of materials and then the pressure of our economy had been can contribute to the added costs, as well as the continuous improvement in implementing, in monitoring and implementation of this measure, as well as I'm actually have an idea in innovating and integrating one measure in our ordinance is the innovation type. wherein let's say as an architect, we can reuse the recoverable materials in our site, which we can complement in reusing into an artwork. Let's say the used bars that we can reuse in artistic interpretation, or reuse in the pinch buildings, or pictures of the projects, as well as the economic side and the other sustainable measure. So I think I had pick up and learn some to our presenter earlier wherein the modular technology can save the added cost in minimizing the impact of the resource material in our project, as well as Ms. Kathleen said, the training of professional of the embodied carbon footprint that we have. If we can prolong the use of our built environment, as well as the preserving the heritage component of the project, it will be beneficial to the environment. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abram, for your very comprehensive overview and snapshot of CT, as well as your reflection on previous speakers' presentations. So if you can withdraw from your presentation, then we can take the session to the end.
Okay.
You can stop sharing. There's a button there.
Okay. Thank you.
So go on to the next slide. So we have prepared two guiding questions for our discussion session, but unfortunately we do not have time to accommodate these very two interesting questions. So I would put it there as food for thoughts for our presenter. Could you go back, please, to the questions? Yeah, so I would like to thank you all very much, especially our speaker. Very valuable contribution from your side. Yeah, here we are. Can you go to the questions? Thank you. So yeah, the next slide. The slide before and slide before, these two questions. Yes, thank you very much. So I would just like to put it there as a food for thought for our speaker today. We might not have time to address that. Maybe you could think about that. If you have some reflection, you could maybe send it to me by email. Then I'm happy to pass it on to CT of Philippines. So the first question is, what do the speaker learn from your presentation? A project can be further developed. Second one is, how do the speakers see the possibility to implement innovation, technology, and policy in the mentions in your presentations? Next slide, please. Next slide. So yeah, I would like to again refer back to the Eagles Circuit platform, where you will find the recording sessions as well as the mentioned report for the webinar series. Next slide. As well as different resources and tools we have developed for the CT, such as this tool 5-step guide to kick off circular development. Next slide, please. As well as we would like to invite all of you to our next webinars. So we have a webinar on food in June, and a webinar about circular fashion and textile in August, and a webinar about circular water and sanitation in October. Next slide, please. And of course, we would like to sincerely invite you to ICLE World Congress, where you can find it also a series of different events and sessions dedicated to the topic of circular economy. And we will have kind of hybrid format for this Congress, which means you can join the event both online and in person. Next slide. At the end, I would like to thank again for all the speaker and all the participants. I mean, this is really wonderful webinar. Like I really lost track of time, like such a great content and your contribution. So I really say, let us make this kind of discussion more often and more visible. So we all know it's such an important topic for the sector of our work. So again, thank you for your time and I wish you all a very nice time. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everyone.
everyone. Bye.